always such a treat to have Martin Walker back with us. He's going to be talking about his 17th. How is that possible? 17th in the wonderful Bruno series, and also this gorgeous cookbook, Bruno's cookbook. We'll talk about that. But I'm delighted to have Denis Bobin. Forgive me, I speak Spanish, not French, but from the Alliance Française, and we're really happy that they're here with us this evening. And I thought I'd give her the microphone briefly and have her tell a few words about the organization and what you do.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Very nice to be with you tonight. Alliance Française is a French cultural and linguistic center. We are located in Scottsdale. And tonight we are very happy and privileged to share this event with President Penn, and particularly to welcome Martin Walker, who is a recipient of the Alliance Française in Washington, D.C., actually, a federation of the Alliance Française. He received the Prix Charbonnier in 2021. And the Prix Charbonnier is an award given to personality who help to promote French language and French culture. And among the recipients of the Prix Charbonnier, there is Christian Dior, Julia Child, François Truffaut, and more. Pierre Cardin. So in 2021, Martin joined the group of celebrity. So thank you very much. So if you want more information about Alliance Française, I am here, and we can talk after the interview. Thank you very much.
And you brought wine.
Oh yes, there is some French wine, Chardonnay and what, Claude? What are the wine? Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay from France. So you are welcome. À la buvette, like we say in French, right? Thank you, Martin.
Well, thanks so much, Janine. Great to have you here. And well, Martin, it's really wonderful to have you back at the store. Barbara Peters, the owner of the store, is out having a real rough time on a cruise somewhere. No, but she sends her regrets. She'd love to be here. But I don't know. Your books are such. How many of you just love escaping into this sort of bucolic, beautiful world? You know, the food, the ambiance, so much a part of the world. The more civilized pace of life, or so it seems to us, anyway.
Seems that way to me too.
But trouble often arises when kind of forces conspire to threaten that in some way. And Bruno is there, the man of the people.
Indeed he is, yes.
So you're going to have to use the mic simply for the people watching.
Yep. Indeed he is.
Yes.
Yeah. And trouble always does emerge in one way or the other.
Yeah.
And but there's one thing in this particular book that I was really, really keen to do, which is that I was very struck in the years I've spent in the Périgord to realize how many connections there are between the United States and the Périgord in particular. Well, not just the United States, Canada as well. There is a real North American link here. And I wanted to bring that out. And so I have a character in this particular book who embodies something of that. But it was wonderful that before I came over here on Friday afternoon, I was just outside Bordeaux in an area of the vineyards of Bordeaux called the Pessac-Léognan. And I was having lunch with Eric Perrin, who runs the Chateau Carbonniers. And I was standing, after we'd had a very nice lunch, and we went out into the garden and we stood and looked at the American pecan tree that Thomas Jefferson had planted right there in 1787. And I'd always been struck by Thomas Jefferson's connections in this part of the world because when you look at the White House, if you know the Périgord, there is a building called La Bachellerie, which is just near Terrasson, which is clearly the model for the White House. Now it's grey in colour rather than white, but Thomas Jefferson did a sketch which in effect became the model for what became the White House, which I rather enjoyed. And then I always loved the connection between Jefferson and Fénelon. And Fénelon is a very strange figure. He's not too well known these days, but back in the late 17th, early 18th century, he was perhaps the most intellectually prominent figure in Europe. And he was widely seen as the father of the Enlightenment, the Lumière, as the French call them. And he was from a family. The family of Fénelon was, or de la Motte Fénelon, to give the full name. They had a chateau in the Dordogne Valley, quite near Salah. And traditionally, the eldest son of the family would be the baron and would run the chateau. And the youngest son would become the bishop of Salah. And Fénelon was being groomed for that job. He was a brilliant young priest, and in Paris, he got this idea that there were all these very intelligent young women around the court, but they weren't being educated, and he set up a school for the education of young gentlewomen, and it became the fashionable thing. This is in like the 1680s, and it was so popular and so well thought of that Fénelon was then asked to become the tutor to the Dauphin, the heir to Louis XIV, who was at this point Louis's grandson, who was a young man of limited intelligence, I think it's fair to say. But Fénelon persevered and did a very good job with him. In a way, he did too good a job. And one of the tools that he used was that he wrote a book that was called Telemachus. And those of you who've had a classical education will know that Telemachus was the son of Ulysses. And after Ulysses came back from the Trojan Wars and his voyages, there was his son Telemachus, who was determined to defend his mother Penelope. And so what Fénelon did was write a book about how the son of Ulysses was brought up to be a really good king. And he was given a guide who was called Mentor, who took him all around the ancient world into Turkey and Greece and Sparta and so on, and to try and see what was the best form of government. And it was really a sort of a voyage of exploration around different kinds of governance. And the point that he ended up making was that it is not the job of the people to serve the king. It is the job of the king to serve the people and to make them grow and develop. And we might think this is, common sense within a monarchical sort of sense. But in the court of the Sun King, the absolute monarch Louis XIV, whose private chaplain was a cardinal called Bossuet, who was the man who dreamed up the whole philosophy of the king as the God's representative on earth. He and Louis XIV were horrified at this clearly heretical left-wing Jacobin view about the role of the church and the monarchy, and there was our poor Fénelon sent into exile to be Archbishop of Cambrai at a time when Cambrai was actually behind enemy lines, occupied by the Spanish army up in the old Spanish Netherlands. But this book by Fénelon became the bestseller of the 18th century all across Europe. It went into over 180 editions in over 14 languages. And nobody had ever seen it, had come across anything quite like this before. Certainly not except for the Bible itself. But some of the great names like Erasmus and Spinoza and so on, none of them had anything like the kind of impact that Fenelon did. And for Thomas Jefferson, he was close to being a god. In Jefferson's library is the only writer. 4 copies of that book of Telemachus were in Jefferson's library. So I've always been fascinated by this. I love the actual castle where Fenelon was born and brought up, and that whole sort of tradition of the French Enlightenment, or of the French learned, a bit sort of rebellious in their thinking clerics like Fenelon. And I just love that connection that there is back to Thomas Jefferson. And so in this particular novel, we start off where Bruno has been injured in the last book. He's been in convalescent homes. And he comes back, and before he resumes his full duties, his friend Clotilde, who is the red-headed woman, a little powerhouse, 5 foot tall. She's the curator at the National Museum of Prehistory in Les Aisies, and her German husband, Horst, who is also an archaeologist. And she has a guest with her, a young American woman, a young American archaeologist, whom in effect Clotilde had trained. And this woman has just come through a very unhappy marriage, and she's thrown up her job in the US and has this idea of trying to set up a whole new career as a guide for Americans in the Périgord into the particular closeness between the Americans and this region of France. So this woman then proceeds to try and explain to Bruno what it is that she plans to do. Well, I'll start with Thomas Jefferson, she says, and his admiration for Archbishop Fenelon, and take them to visit the chateau where Fenelon was born, and to Ruffiac, where Jefferson stayed. I'd take them to the chateau at La Bachellerie, near Terrasson, whose plans Jefferson copied as a design for the White House. Then there's Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, who began writing The Wasteland while the two poets were on a walking tour in the Périgord just after World War I. Many people, including me, think The Wasteland is the greatest poem of the 20th century, Abby went on, warming to her theme. And of course, Ezra Pound virtually adopted the troubadours of the Périgord. He translated the songs of Bertrand de Born and even wrote poems in the old Occitan language. And since T.S. Eliot also wrote the verse play Murder in the Cathedral, about the killing of Thomas Becket, I take visitors to the chapel of Saint-Martin near Limeuil. It was one of the 3 churches the Pope ordered King Henry II of England to build as a penance for the murder of his Archbishop Thomas à Becket, 2 of the churches in England and 1 in France. I love the medieval frescoes in that chapel of Saint-Martin, not just the big ones behind the altar, but the little ones too. They're fading but still so beautiful. Bruno smiled and nodded approval. You can tell your clients that the experts say they represent true Old Testament prophets, but we locals all think the fresco of the 2 men with the bottle in the side chapel represent Thomas à Becket and King Henry in happier times when they were close friends and drinking companions. I'll make a point of it, she said, for the first time smiling at him warmly. Bruno felt a little like a schoolboy being praised by a teacher. I'd also want to talk about the American paratroopers who were dropped near Cadouin in August of 1944 to help the resistance. There weren't too many Germans left here by then, but they were able to join in the Liberation Parade in Périgueux. Then there were the Lindbergh family, the family of the first pilot to fly across the Atlantic. His son married Monique Watteau, a local writer. Then I'd take him to Josephine Baker's Château des Milandes, not just a superstar of the jazz age, but Josephine Baker was also asked by Martin Luther King's widow to take over the leadership of the civil rights movement after after Martin Luther King was assassinated. She declined, Bruno said, saying she felt obliged to continue raising her rainbow family, children she had adopted from almost every race on Earth. Horst broke in to say, We took Abby to that American-owned vineyard you recommended to us, Bruno, the Chateau de Fayol near Sausignac, with that lovely red Sang de Sanglier wine you raved about. So Abby's also thinking of a day touring the vineyards. Sang du Sanglier, blood of wild boar, Bruno murmured, smiling. Then you could cross the river to the Unravel region and take them to Montaigne's tower, where you could read out Montaigne's great essay on the American Indians he had met. That's a good idea, said Abby. I'd been wondering how to bring in Montaigne. She gave him that warm smile again. That would make an excellent bridge, and just a little further is the Chateau de Montréal, one of whose sons explored the St. Lawrence River in the 17th century and gave the name of his family home to the place that became Montreal. Montréal. My congratulations, said Bruno, looking at her with respect as Ivan came in with the soup tureen. He was impressed by her research. You've certainly done your homework, he said, but I hesitate to bring up something you may already know. Have you heard of the Duc de Lauzun? Abby shook her head. No, is that in the Périgord? Not quite, Bruno replied. It's just over the border in Lot-et-Garonne, but the Duke was also the Marquis of Biron. That's a splendid medieval fortress in the south of the Dordogne, close to the Bastide of Montpensier. And this Marquis of Biron deserves to be better known as one of the founders of your country. As an explorer? She asked. I've not heard of him. No, not as an explorer, but as a soldier. He was an aristocrat and also a professional soldier. Charming young boy, he was brought up almost at the knee of the royal mistress, the Madame de Pompadour. But as he grew up to become a serious soldier, he was volunteered to become the leader of a group of volunteers who fought alongside the Marquis of Lafayette in the liberation of the United States. Above all, he fought with George Washington and Lafayette at the siege of Yorktown in 1781, the battle that forced the surrender of the British Army under General Cornwallis and thus secured American independence. The Duke did well enough in the battle to be chosen by Washington and Lafayette for the honour of taking the news of the great victory back to the King in Paris. Well, that's a wonderful addition to my list, said Abby. How on earth did you come across that piece of history? Through my dog, said Bruno. Balzac is descended from the old royal hunting pack of King Louis XIV at Cheverny. But you may have heard that basset hounds were introduced to America by the Marquis of Lafayette. He took a breeding pair as a gift to George Washington, who imported several more, and that led to what is now known as the Stonewall Jackson breed of bassets in the United States. And Balzac has some of that ancestry, a fact that prompted me to do some research into Lafayette and his adventures in your War of Independence, and that is how I came across the memoirs of the Marquis of Biron. Well, that's a lovely story, said Clotilde. I've always known, Bruno, that your dog was a natural aristocrat.
Perfect segue to this wonderful picture.
This is the only cookbook, I think, for humans which has ever included a recipe for dog biscuits. And
Tell
anyway,
us a
there
little
he
bit
is.
about Balzac. How long have you had him?
Well, he's now 6 years old,
Okay.
but he's the fourth that we've had in the family. We've had a whole tradition of having bassets because my wife's family had a tradition that went back for several generations in her family too. It's always been a special thing about about having these wonderful dogs who are brave as lions, but as gentle as.
So what,
Nothing could be more gentle with children.
what were Balzac's predecessors named? Zola, I'm assuming.
No,
and-
they were always named with somebody out with B. There was a Byron.
Okay.
Normally a writer would be. There was a Byron. There was a Bentham. There was a Benson for L.S. Benson. There was a Baudelaire.
Of course.
And
Boswell.
Bothwell. And Boswell, I mean. And we've got one or two in store as well. So,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, I was hoping we might be calling this one Blake after William Blake, who would have. But I thought Balzac is pretty good too.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's fascinating about the wasteland. Did any of you know that? About Eliot and Pound?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you were talking about that notion of the king as serving the people, it reminded me a little bit of Bruno, of course. You know, his modus operandi. He has that great quote about, you know, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's easier to prevent crime, or better to prevent crime
Yeah.
than to have
To
to
solve
solve it.
Right.
And you know, this whole idea of community policing is
Well, this was what This is what attracted me to this idea. The guy, sadly, he died earlier this year. The Bruno, his real name was Pierrot, and he was our village policeman. He'd been 10 years in the French army, and he was for many years my tennis partner. And we were very close friends, and he taught me a lot about hunting and gardening and stuff. And he was a guy who spent all of his spare time teaching the local kids to play rugby in the winter and tennis in the summer. And he was pretty unique in that he was a firm believer that women should be able to play rugby too if they wanted. And one of the things I'm really pleased about is that we were both there, the two of us together, when his greatest pupil, wonderful young woman, came back from the Olympics in Japan and Korea, carrying the silver medal that she'd won playing rugby for France in the Seven-a-Sides. And I mean, that was really something, because no male rugby player from our region had ever got anything like that kind of accolade. And that was Pierrot. He was such a fine man. He died. He was 66 when he died, and it was one of those awful sort of things, and a terrible shock to us all. But it, in a way, I mean, I'm delighted to be able to commemorate this guy here, because it was a very remarkable way of being a cop, and certainly there was almost no crime in our area. He also had all these other wonderful ideas, like he persuaded the local college, the kids up to the age of 16 or so, that in their last year, each of them should adopt some old person in the old folks' home who wasn't in their own particular family, and should help to build up a kind of a scrapbook with this old person, with old family photos and so on, that this young person could get a sense of what the life of this neighbor townsperson had been like. And that was amazing to see, you know, when you'd be at the funerals, and there would be these old people sort of hand in hand with these young students whom they'd got to know. So, I mean, I've got to say, this is an extraordinary town that I have become devoted to in the Perigord. And it's not just wonderful food and good wine and fellowship and rugby and sport. They really take care of each other, and they take that sense of community seriously. And I like to be able to focus a bit on that in my novels, and it's a real pleasure to be able to do so. And anyway, just with the rugby season just opened last week, and the last Sunday before last, we had the formal meeting of the seniors of the rugby club, and I was made elected vice president, which is one of the great honours, I have to say, that I've ever had. And it's, I mean, I've been adopted by this community, and it's very moving to me. It's very touching. I mean, there's not many countries in the world that would open their hearts to a foreigner in this kind of way, but the Périgordins do so, and it's also touching because for me, one of the charms of this area is that it's much, much older than France. I mean, modern France really begins with the end of the Roman Empire, the Franks coming in and under Alaric, and then the great battles and Charlemagne and so on. But the people of the Périgord go back a long, long, long time further. And I always like to point out to my American and British friends who come and let me show them around a bit, that when they get to the Périgord these days, they think of it as a wonderfully green and wooded place with all of these hills on each side of the rivers are full of trees. That's only been the case for the last 200 years or so, because the very same iron ore that produced the colours that you will see in the caves of Lascaux and so on, the yellow ochres and the red colours, they come from the iron ore, the manganese ores in these hills. And that same ore which produced the prehistoric art in the Middle Ages, it made this valley of the River Vézère into the Pittsburgh or the Birmingham of the day, because that was where the iron came from that produced the weapons, the swords, the shields, the helmets. And that carried on until Napoleon's navy, because they were making the cannon for Napoleon's battleships, the wooden battleships, as late as 1800, and shipping them down the river, down to Bordeaux. And what that meant was that when you look at those hills now, and you see them all green with trees, in the old days there was not a tree to be seen. They were all chopped down for the charcoal that would be needed to turn the iron ore into real hard iron. So you have this sort of sudden sense of an industrial centre that is before that a kind of an artistic centre, and then is now a agrarian and tourism centre. The place just keeps reinventing itself, and with a great deal of charm every time that they do. Anyway, this story goes on with this young woman who
Abby.
helps. Oh, sorry.
Abby.
Abby, yeah.
Yeah.
With this young woman, Abby, who helps Bruno when a local small chateau that had fallen into disrepair is being bought up by an Englishman to turn it into a kind of a holiday centre or a bed and breakfast or whatever. And he's part of an operation that, part of a group of these English people doing chateaux who get themselves into a TV program, which has become popular around the world now. It was originally called Do It Yourself Chateau, but it's now on Canal Chéri in France, which I think is number 25 in France, and it's in Germany, it's in every European language, and it's of people watching them as they slowly restore these chateaux, and then what they're going to do with them, with the hotels or wedding centres or whatever. And it has become a hugely popular kind of thing. But in the course of developing this particular chateau, they find an abandoned grave. And that abandoned grave, which the American archaeological young woman, Abby, is there at the time, and is there who can help identify what's inside there, that instantly creates an international incident. And off we go to the races, as we say, and the story sort of unfolds from there. But I had great fun doing it, as I always tend to do. And at this time, it's connected to something else, which is if you ever go to any of the old bridges over the Vézère or Dordogne rivers, you will find that on the inside, on the very top of the high in the arches, you will find little metal stamps or plaques that will say how high the river got to in a particular flood, say in 1944 or in 1961. And this last year, we got one of the highest floods we've had since the dams were first built upriver. And it was almost as high as it was in 1960. I'd never seen anything like it. We had to evacuate large parts of the town of Le Bourg, including Europe's largest indoor inland aquarium. And I don't know if you ever imagined what it's like to evacuate an aquarium when you have all of these great big glass cases full of fish and it's all very delicate. Anyway, that was quite dramatic. And what had happened was that last summer, the waters around France and Britain became very much hotter than usual at the surface. It was about 3 degrees higher than normal. And fish were fleeing to the north, from out of the North Sea and out of the Channel and so on. Really remarkable development. And this superheated surface of the water then began to evaporate in great quantities. And of course, the westerly winds were taking it across France and up to the Massif Central, which is the chunk of ancient exhausted volcanoes. It is now the high ground at the very center of France, and the source of so many of the rivers like the Loire and the Garonne and the Dordogne and the Vézère and so on. And the level of water that we got in the course of last August and last September meant that the dams were consistently having to open the sluice gates because they just couldn't, they'd have been flooded, more than flooded. This is why we're getting these huge, great bursts of floodwater coming down. And it was really quite a dramatic time. So I was actually writing this novel while all this was going on, and I'd sort of come back after a night on watch and think, well, okay, I know what I'm going to write about today. So all that sort of comes in as well.
As always, there are multiple storylines going, including there's even a cryptocurrency angle in this book.
Well, I try and get
A little contemporary.
I try and keep up with the times.
Intrigue, right?
Yeah. Yes, well, you've got to in a way, and I mean, I've found myself disappearing down so many interesting little corridors and rat holes in the course of my researches. Never did I think I would be getting into the tax structure of where is it? The Idaho. And some of the tax systems of American states. I mean, I'd never known that Joe Biden came from a state that was known in financial circles around the world as the place to really launder your money. I mean, Delaware has this extraordinary system of tax rules, which means that it's actually got more corporations than it has citizens in the state of Delaware. And then various other states have got amazing tax systems, but I go into them in some detail because I just find it quite unbelievable that this wonderful country, home of the brave, land of the free.
And then came Citizens United.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how much you want to get into about this discovery that's found. If you want to save it for their surprise, there's so much to discuss.
I think one thing that is.
No spoilers. Save it.
I'm going to save it for you, but one thing that I did like writing about, and this is partly because I'm the father of 2 daughters, and a very how can I put it? a very independent wife who, for whom I've been married for 47 years, and I'm still completely devoted. I was struck by the way in which women, not just in the USA, but in Britain, in France, elsewhere, you're seeing all over the world women organizing themselves in remarkable ways. And one of the things that happened here was that in this particular grave there were some women found in what were obviously unpleasant circumstances of their death. And the women take this up as a cause. And all of a sudden the place is just lifting with this scene of the grave. Hundreds and hundreds of bouquets of flowers start to appear there, which have been placed there in solidarity by the women, to the great surprise of many of the men who'd never thought of their wives as being quite so self-assertive or quite so determined to show their own colors in this kind of way. And this is something that we've seen in France increasingly, I think, since the Harvey Weinstein and similar kinds of scandals. It's remarkable to me how all around the world these days we're seeing this, how do I put it? It's a kind of it's not a rebellion of women, not at all. It's a women simply asserting themselves in political ways in a way that we've not been used to in the past. And as a father of a couple of daughters, I have to say I'm all in favor of it, particularly when it's women asserting their right to decide, what they will have as a sexual partner rather than to be bullied. I don't want to be sort of too pious about all of this, but I am constantly surprised and pleased by the capacity of my wife and daughters to surprise me. That's it.
Right. I mean, it's safe to say, this story does harken back to World War II time period. And you get into, you talk a little bit about the French resistance in the Dordogne. And, one gets the sense just of how deeply personal that still is, to the generations after the war. All these shifting alliances and what people had to do to survive.
It's when we first got a house there, which is back about 25 years ago, more than that now. I realized that the entire generation of the resistance veterans was dying out. So I went around to interview as many of them as I could, particularly ones in my neighborhood. And their stories they just opened my eyes. I had not realized just how grim it was. And because some of the stories that I heard were the saddest came from the women. Because there was a group called the Milice, which was a paramilitary police force serving the Vichy regime, and many of them were passionately pro-Nazi. And they were the guys who were in charge of issuing the ration books. Now, if you want to know why France did not seem at first ready to rise up against the Nazis, it's because there were 1.5 million French prisoners of war in German prisoner of war camps, who were, as it were, so many hostages for French good behavior. But a lot of those guys had wives and children back home in France. And the milice got hold of the monopoly of issuing the ration cards. And for these young women raising children, if they didn't get that ration card, their kids were going to go hungry. So the milice, a lot of them were real bastards, and they traded the ration cards for sexual favors. And when you sort of realize that, it puts it quite a different interpretation or in a different slant about what you think of as the occupation. And I was not at all surprised to find out in one village near me, where when the liberation came, the women. By the way, the women in France at this time, they didn't have any shoes. The leather was taken for the German army. They were wearing sabots, wooden boots, wooden clogs. And they went into they pulled out the milice guys, and the women of the village just kicked them to death with their sabots. Quite right too, if you ask me. They deserved it. But you know, I start to break down when I think of some of these stories that I heard about what it was like living in the woods, trying to take shelter from the German. The Germans did one appalling thing, which was that they recruited through a French football player, Villaplana, who had been playing in the French World Cup team in the 1930s, and then he had been spent a while as a coach for various soccer teams of the young Arabs living in the slums of Marseille and Toulon. And he joined the milice, this guy, Villaplana. And he then began recruiting these young Arabs to become part of a division of the SS, wearing black uniforms and so on. And they were known as the anti-terrorist unit. And they went around the farms of the Périgord and other rural areas, terrorizing the farmers to stop them feeding or looking after or sustaining the resistance in any ways. You know, they'd burn down the farms. It was just awful. It was deliberately using these Arabs as a form of terrorism.
When did The Stranger come out? The Camus?
That
roughly?
came out, it was published in 1945. Yeah.
1945, okay. Yeah.
Sorry, yes, that came first, then La Peste came after that. Yeah, the plague came after that. But it's quite it's a grim, bloody story. It really is, because there were places where where there were bridges over the Dordogne and Vézère rivers where a handful of kids with hunting rifles or shotguns would try and slow down German reinforcements going to the front. And they'd gain, half an hour, maybe an hour? And yet they did it. And the German retaliation was ruthless. Mouledier, they just destroyed it with artillery. Ruffignac, they burned it down. Oradour-sur-Glane, 600 women and children stuffed inside a church, and the church was set alight. War, it's a pretty ruthless operation, I'm afraid. But anyway.
And what constitutes a war crime, which is another thing that
it depends who is the judge.
Exactly, which we won't spoil it, but you get into these kind of topics, which seem very contemporary in this new book, sadly.
Yeah. Well, it's these elemental issues do not change very much.
No.
And it's it's odd that I feel obliged to get into some sort of difficult and anguished areas when I really want to write about, you know, the beauties of this glorious part of France, the historical riches, the glorious food, the generosity of the people, the extraordinary quality and good value of the wine of the Périgord. But there we are. Life is always a bit complicated. How many of you have been to this part of France at all? Oh, wow. Oh, excellent. So how many of you have been to Lascaux? Wow. Well, so you know something of the kind of a passion that I have developed for this area.
Good segue.
That was about my first novel about the Périgord. Yeah. Right. That was the first one I wrote. Came out in 2002, I think. Yeah.
Is this is not currently in print, is it?
It is still in print. Yeah.
In America?
Yeah. Well, in Britain it is. Yeah.
In Britain, I don't think it's in print currently here, but it would be great to see it back.
Well, yeah, I remember we should do it. It's I mean, it's my wife thinks it's her favorite of my books. So.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got to ask you, after this distinguished career as a journalist, you're with The Guardian for 25 years, right?
Right.
And then the API, and then this, I believe this was 2002. Is that right? What, And then 2008, of course, we begin our journey with Bruno. Tell us a little bit about making that transition from, you published at least 10 books that I know of, nonfiction books, and being involved in that world, and then making the transition into being a mystery writer.
Well, it was just about, I'd written all sorts of very tedious, or traditional journalist kind of books, which I was fascinated by. I mean, I was in Russia at the time of Gorbachev and Perestroika for 4 years, and so I wrote what turned out to be the first book about Gorbachev. And I also wrote a book about Bill Clinton and his presidency. And I'd first of all written a book about the rise of the extreme right in Europe in the 1970s, which feels a bit like déjà vu. Now we're seeing it all over again. But this is what, as a journalist, this is what you tended to do. You were focusing upon something and you began to research and you wanted to write about it. But when we got our place in the Perigord, which was in '98, that was when I started going around interviewing all these elderly resistance people, and that produced this eventually. This is a book in which I try and bring together my passion for the prehistoric art of the Perigord and with this heart-wrenching story of World War II. And I try to interweave two historical periods together. I had great fun writing it, but I then was so busy because I was asked to take over. I was running United Press International at a very difficult time, and we had at the time not just the US, the worldwide English language service, we had a Spanish language service, we had an Arabic language service, so it was I was too busy to do anything but try and run the company. But then I managed to get the time, and I began writing the Bruno books, and then the cookbooks, and then the Bruno short stories, and so he's sort of taken over my life really. But I'm just so pleased that I have sort of come across this particular magical part of the world, and I'm very closely involved in a lot of what happens with Lascaux, because there are now 4 Lascaux. There is the original Lascaux #1, Lascaux #2, which is the copy that was organized by Malraux, who was the Minister of Culture, Lascaux #4, which is the modern high-tech, wonderful new museum, and then the Lascaux 3 is the traveling Lascaux, which takes about 60 trucks or container loads. And whenever they go to an English-speaking country, like to Canada, or when they came here to Houston and so on, then I go along as an interpreter, the English sort of speaker, to talk about Lascaux and what it was and how it was so important. And there's nothing anywhere quite like it. Altamira in Spain is something like it, but Lascaux is just so ambitious. And
what is it like experiencing those great painted caves in the flesh? Has anybody else been there?
It's life-changing.
That's what I've heard. I've heard it's just...
It is. You have to bear in mind, you're going from complete darkness into something that will be as long as this entire bookstore and higher than the ceiling. It'll be another 6 feet more height. And it's about as narrow as this. And there are over 600 animals. There are these 4 huge, monstrous bulls that dominate the ceiling and the top of the walls. Hundreds of horses, some of them fall into their deaths, we don't know why. Other different kinds of animals. There is an ibex, there are horses, there are goats, and they have tricks. So you know that these animals are moving because they have invented perspective. I mean,
I'm so glad I asked this question.
yeah, no, we normally think that perspective is something that was developed with the Renaissance. No, they had it. They used to sort of, there would be a gap between the hooves and the legs, and between the legs and the actual body, which gives you that sense of movement. The rear legs were clearly smaller than the forelegs. There was clearly a turning of the heads to get the horns moving. I mean, these people were Picasso. When he went down to see it, he said, "We have met our masters. We have learned nothing in all these thousands of years."
I remember Joseph Campbell was talking about going there, and he said that he got the sense that when you get in the cave, that this world is primary, and that the world out there, that we come from, is secondary. I thought that was an interesting way to look at it.
The one thing that well, there are many things that I'm awed by, but one is this place was deep underground. How on earth did they see to paint? And people say, well, okay, they would light a torch. And no. The walls were white chalk. If they'd taken a torch in, the smoke would have darkened those walls very quickly. And those walls are still chalk white. They found the only technology that would give light without smoke. And it was rendered reindeer fat, so reindeer fat that had been boiled. They invented a lamp, little sort of declivity in stone, into which the reindeer fat was put. And then they would put a twig of juniper, the only wick that would burn without smoke, that would give a flame without smoke. They invented that 18,000 years ago. Picasso was right. We really haven't learned all that much. The other thing is they invented scaffolding, because those bulls up there on the ceiling, how did they get up there to paint? They had to build a scaffold that would let them get up.
And how many people died painting them?
We don't know.
Well, so-and-so just fell to his death, up there on the sea.
Yeah, we just don't know. We think it took about 300 to 400 years altogether, but that's pretty much of a guess. But for me, it was a life-changing thing, and every year I go back, and I'm still awed every single time by it, because you will never think of cavemen as primitive again.
Yeah, gotta get over there. Gotta go see that.
Yeah. And it just shows how fundamental art is to us.
Have you visited any of the great Mayan ruins?
Sorry,
The Mayan ruins in
yes, I have.
Central America?
Oh yeah. And
Yeah, we went to
down
Tikal once, which was pretty.
I've been to several of them, but also I've been to the ones in Spain and in Turkey and in parts of the Middle East. It's once you get into this kind of thing, it's really fascinating. And what's the only thing that comes close to it are some of the Australian Aboriginal cave paintings, which it's very some of them it's uncertain just how old they are, but they clearly they're of a size and a scale that's similar, but they didn't have quite the colorings at that time. And then in the Sahara, in the Hagar Mountains, you have a whole medieval set of these. In Middle Ages, they were drawing these things. It's something. It seems to be something that almost defines us as human. That you get the right kind of wall, we're going to paint on it, and it's terrific.
Well, it's amazing to think of Phoenix, on the ruins of this great, canal system that was built by the Hohokam many, many years ago.
Yeah.
Incredible stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's. No matter where you go, whether you're looking at American Indians, whether you're looking at the cave artists of South America or of Australia, this kind of level of human ingenuity and artistic passion is just remarkable.
Some of the Celtic sites too.
Yeah. I've go up to the Braes in Shetlands and so on. The scale of those.
New
or
Grange.
The paintings in Ireland and the.
we digress. But
We do, but we're an extraordinary species, folks. We really are. And,
so do the Bruno books have any kind of literary inspiration? I mean, obviously Simenon casts a huge shadow over French literature, and by the way, he wrote. Did anybody read that wonderful? It was about resistance called "Dirty Snow" or "The Snow is Dirty."
Yeah.
One of Simenon's books.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a great one.
It is a very good one. The well, it's much more famous in his day than Simenon was Arsène Lupin, who pulled off whose author pulled off one of the
LeBlanc.
great PR tricks of all time, because he was inspired by Sherlock Holmes, the success of Sherlock Holmes in Britain. So this French writer creates Arsène Lupin to be the brilliant French private eye, detective, gentleman thief as well. But he sets up a story in which Sherlock Holmes is brought to Paris and is greeted by newspaper headlines saying, "The duel to the death between the two great detectives, Arsène Lupin and Sherlock Holmes." And Sherlock Holmes then gets involved in this detection and so on. And what then happened in real life was that Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, brought a legal case to stop this continuing. And so the author of Arsène Lupin said, "All right, if I have to." So he renamed the English detective Sherlock Sholmes. Very smart.
That'll show him.
Yeah.
But any literary influences for you that kind of?
I don't know. I've never stopped. I do not think of myself as being in any way literary in these yarns of Bruno.
I think we'd all disagree with that, wouldn't we?
I don't know. I've read so many. I've read a great deal of crime stories and thrillers and so on, and I admire an awful lot of them. I was asked to do something recently, which was, could Bruno organize a dinner party for those other crime figures, detectives, who would actually appreciate it? And I was thinking, well, Raymond Chandler never eats. And most American detectives hardly eat at all. Nero Wolfe does think about his food, and he has his favorite dish, which is trout montana, which is trout that's cooked over on a wood fire and so on. But it contains some really unusual items. But anyway, so I organised this dinner party, and we had. Miss Marple came up with an apple and meringue tart, and Nero Wolfe had his his trout montana. Raymond Chandler finished up with one of the sad lettuces that he referred to at one particular time. Sherlock Holmes had the oysters and woodcock, which are referred to in A Scandal in Bohemia. And that's the only special wine that's brought in, because Sherlock Holmes really likes a Baume de Venise, and so I had to have a bottle of that.
With a little cocaine.
Yeah. Well, no, I didn't get into that one. No. But the, I don't know. I got into the whole food of it because I was living in the Périgord, and the Périgord. Nothing is as important as food, really. Love, so on. And Lascaux, but food is of huge importance. And so I couldn't imagine writing about a French policeman in the Périgord who was not taking huge care about his meals and his diet and his cooking. And then I came to realize that more and more people were enjoying the food. And we began to get my publishers began to get letters demanding a cookbook. So,
what was it like doing that with your wife? Was that
wonderful?
Was it?
Yeah. because she is such a good cook, and I mean, Julia had been a food journalist for many years, and is just a wonderful cook. I mean, when we married her, I didn't realize just what a glorious cook she was. Otherwise, I'd have married her long before, I suppose. But and she's also she's a very excellent gardener, but she's also very patient with me as I'm sort of learning to cook, because every dish that you will find in a Bruno, I've had to cook myself. But usually with Julia standing at my shoulder saying, not so much salt, or you ought to give a bit more time for those onions to get tender, and this kind of thing. And it's a lovely thing to do together, cooking together and eating together. So that's been great fun. What was really hilarious was the cookbook first came out in German, and it was launched at the Frankfurt Book Fair when there's an organization called Gourmand International, which announces the world's best French restaurant, or world's best restaurant, or world's best chef, or whatever. And at the Frankfurt Book Fair, they were doing a special series on what they thought were the world's best cookbooks. And the first Bruno cookbook got the title of World's Best French Cookbook, which came as a considerable shock to my friends back in France. And most of them have forgiven me for it now, but some have not. But it was, I mean, the thing is that I was the first person to write about Périgord cuisine outside of France. And it is a very specific cuisine. And it's quite famous for it. Back in the 18th century, there was this German king, Frederick the Great of Prussia, who had built himself this special little hideaway castle called Sans Souci, without care, which was meant to be for him and his close friends, half a dozen guys, to be there and to tell stories and to eat wonderfully well together. And one of his friends was Voltaire. So once the place was sort of almost finished, Frederick the Great wrote to Voltaire and said, "Now, you're going to be one of my friends who comes to Sans Souci to eat, but so I'm going to need you to get me a really good chef, and because there aren't any in Germany." So Voltaire sort of ponders this, and he goes to see a man called André Noël, who is the master of the pâté de Périgueux in Périgueux itself. And the pâté de Périgueux, which exists to this day, and I'm a member of the confrérie of the pâté de Périgueux, it's foie gras wrapped in black truffle slices, and then all covered in a pork terrine, and then with pastry all around it. And he designed it like this so that it wouldn't rot by the time it got up to Paris on fast horses. And so Voltaire says to Noël, "Would you like to come and take this job over?" And Noël said, "I can't. I've got my business here. However, I've got this really, really smart young son who is the best chef I know." So Voltaire takes young Noël off to Sans Souci. Frederick the Great is entranced. He begins writing poetry in praise of this wonderful young Périgord chef and calls him the César of cuisine. So, the fame of the Périgord food goes out long before. So,
Well, before we wrap it up, I'd like to open it up to questions that you might have. Anybody?
Is there still a bit of tension, even generations after World War II? Who was in the resistance? Who was...
yes. Yes, I mean, I remember 20 years ago now, a young couple who had to almost elope together because his father had been in the resistance and her father had been seen as something of a collaborator. And it was tricky. But I think those days are just about gone now. I mean, after all, there's nobody left, nobody's left alive who was in the resistance. Another neighbor of mine, Joe, who got a Légion d'honneur because he had been at the age of 10, he'd been a messenger boy for the resistance. He was the last living one, and he's gone. So, and time passes. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is the next Bruno coming out next year?
Yes, it's finished. It's called An Enemy in the Village. It's already, we're going through the editing process at the moment with my editor in the UK. And I've started plotting out the next one, Bruno 19. So Bruno will continue writing again if the Lord be willing and the creek don't rise, as they say. Sir.
So your first book was I'll call it a standalone novel.
Yeah.
And then you switch into the series and you're very prolific in this series. And I've always wondered why or how would a novelist come to writing a series? Is it deliberately? Is it randomly?
For the people watching it, the question is about writing a series as opposed to a standalone, and how do you make that
How did it come about that, having done the standalone Caves of Périgord, I then began writing about Bruno? Well, Julia, my wife, we'd been in the summer of, I think, 2006. Yeah, 2006. We'd been there for a long summer, the two of us and with the kids, and I was sort of writing away at this novel about my friend Pierrot, or Bruno as I called him. And I showed it to Julia, and she said, you have something here. She said, but you can't possibly call your hero Pierrot. It's going to have be an international name, something like Bruno. And she said, and you have to realize that publishers are much more interested if they think there's going to be a series. So go away and write 5 paragraphs, one on each of the next 5 in the series around Bruno. And Julia, who had worked in publishing for some years, knew what she was talking about. And so I did what she said and wrote these brief synopsis of future Brunos. And 3 months later, my agent came back to me and said, well, we've sold it in Germany, the USA, England, so Julia is always right. It's a very, very good standard to live by, gentlemen, if you're... any other? Yes.
This might be a group that would enjoy knowing about Julia's blog.
Oh, yes, a Substack.
Yes.
My wife, who is cannot stop writing about food, every week she writes a Substack column, which you can read for free. It's called Tabled. So if you go into substack.com and look for Tabled, and her name is Julia Watson, and I think it's the best food column on the net, on the internet these days. It's full of history about foods, and she's a real scholar on these matters. And
Not going to share some politics with us tonight?
well, the politics of France are baffling even the French these days. I mean, we have a minority government, and what must be seen as a lame duck president, who has still got 3 years to go. And it's very difficult to see where the political system goes from here. One of the problems is that Macron brought this upon himself. Macron thought that he could create a new politics of the center that was neither left nor right. And in doing so, with great enthusiasm in 2017 when it began, what people didn't realize was that he had brought in the center left and the center right, leaving the far left and the far right. And when he began to lose popularity, the far right and the far left became more and more important as the negative factors in the overall equation. And this is something we're now seeing challenging, I think, an awful lot of countries. In some ways, I think that what's happened in Germany reflects part of this. In some ways, we're all, in Germany, in France, in Britain, in the USA, we're all responding to what has become a really remarkable wave of migration. And a wave of migration that is likely to increase given environmental pressures and so on. And of course, given the fact that white Americans, white Europeans, white Japanese, Chinese are not breeding anymore. We're no longer producing enough babies to maintain our population. So surprise, surprise, we're getting migration. And I've got no idea where this is heading, and I don't think anybody does. But it's clearly going to be a different kind of politics in the future. And as I think we're learning over the course of the next 50 days here in the USA. And as a visitor, a guest in your country, I wouldn't presume to comment upon the
That's
challenges
probably
before
good.
you. No?
Yeah. Well, you have some exciting, to take it into safer territories. You have some exciting TV news.
Yes, we've signed a deal with Fox for a TV series, and the first couple of scripts are written, and I've got an appointment to be helping sort them out on locations in the Périgord. So I'm looking forward to that, and hope it works, and hope they get the right Bruno. But yes, it's, well, lots of deals are signed and never accomplished, so I'm still touching wood and fingers crossed, but let's hope Bruno makes it to the screen as well. So I'm sorry. Huh?
Paul Newman going to play Bruno?
Well, I wish he were young enough to do so, yeah. I've got no idea who's going to play Bruno. Oops, sorry, there was a question at the back.
A bit facetious question, but was this your idea of retirement?
No, it wasn't really.
Seems like a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, don't forget, I was actually holding down, I was running a think tank, an international think tank, for the first 7 years of writing Brunos. But then, I'm now retired and still turning them out. So, I don't know. Yes, it's a wonderful way to retire. I'd rather rust out than just wear out, or wear out than just, yeah. It's amazing how your life can get taken over by something like this. Because I'm now, when I think about it, I'm doing about 3 months a year of touring, of book tours with him now. Bruno is sort of there all the time, really, with editors saying, when is the next one going to be finished? And yeah.
I stumbled upon your books. I started listening to audiobooks for the first time in my life, taking walks with my dog. And I crack up my father's from Paris, and it's always the putain de merde and the bonheur. I am laughing out loud, on the streets, because my dad always, I'm the oldest 6 kids, and he'd always pound the table and say, "Quelle bordel." So when I hear that in my ears, it's very different than, holding it on paper. And then I had a French foreign exchange student, and at high school she was playing tennis, and that's a standard word. She misses. She's like, putain, and nobody knows what she's saying. So
No, the
funny.
French are the most artistic swearers.
Yes. Yeah. And I was going to ask you too. I just happened upon learning about a cave that's along the ocean in the south of France.
Right.
That the French diver
That's right. They have to dive into it
had
and
to
then come
dive
back.
in.
Yeah.
It used to be you could walk into it,
Yeah.
but have you been there?
No, I haven't.
The
Because you
museum?
need to be an aqualung specialist.
Oh, well, they built the museum. They've recreated it exactly.
They did a copy, a Alaska like copy.
But what's so amazing are the hand
Yeah.
impressions, and it's like X-ray where there's red around it and
Yeah.
black. It's beautiful.
There's
And they
a-
had penguins. So
There's a lovely cave just outside Les Aisies called Fondegon, and it has long frieze of buffalo. But if you get down below, you can see tiny children's hands in the paint. Sorry, you can see tiny children's hands who'd been playing with the paint and putting their palms. And there are places you can see. I mean, and this was so useful because in most of the 20th century, nobody ever thought that women would have been painters. It was meant to be the guys only. And it was only through analysis of the handprints that we realized that probably half of the painters were women, simply because the shapes of women's hands tends to be somewhat different. But then this one with the babies, the children all sort of playing, I mean, you can just sort of see that, mum and dad painting away, the kids down on their knees, down on the ground, and it's wonderful, it really is.
Well, we should probably break up and have you sign some books for us. But thank you so much, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I know these chairs are a little bit uncomfortable.
And a special thanks to the Alliance Française for
That's right.
Your support.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for watching online.